Right, good evening to about 160 registered members. That is double our usual number when held at the Abbey. Zoom is more convenient for many, but we certainly missed the corridor chat on a Saturday afternoon. I know Simon has logged in from a sunny 21 degrees in Nice. Good evening to you. I'm Robert Leachman, your chairman, and I've penciled a few notes, really comments that I've added during the year. I continually encourage members I meet to try different waters listed in our yearbook. We have 30 miles of rivers, including the mixed fisheries of the Lower Avon. I'm sure you will be impressed upon arrival and wonder why you have not previously visited a new water. I wonder how many of you fished the water in the background. I took this shot in September. I have fished all the 30 maps during the season and would like to compliment the keepers on their outstanding work maintaining this portfolio. It can be hard enough maintaining a small garden with the excessive growth this year, but 30 miles. The information in the yearbook is crucial to the smooth running of our fisheries. Please read in particular the page you are fishing. Each year there are invariably changes from our riparian owners which need to be noted. A particular frustration is when members do not sign in before fishing and just turn the tag. I experienced this at Wiley and Stapleford. More hatches has also been mentioned on the forum. The yearbook clearly states sign in and sign out. Membership numbers remain strong, 1,493 game and 350 course members. The waiting list is now 391. We invited 100 off the list last year, so 3 to 4 years to get in. Not surprising really when one considers the value for many for fully keepered venues with no booking in advance. I had my annual trip to Hamer last week. No wind and like a mill pond. The fish were feeding just below the surface. I encourage those that have not visited to cast a line. The weed has died back, but if possible, go when the wind speed is low, much like Stapleford. The keepers have identified a new wading stretch on an existing water. Full details in the 22-23 yearbook. John will comment on grayling numbers, but there will be a change to note in his talk. When I recently arrived at the gauging station, a returning angler had an indicator the size of a large marble. Float fishing on short streams, I thought. I have asked John to show a slide on this. New members will not have had the opportunity to attend our casting / open day at the Abbey. We hope to hold this next May, which gives you a chance to get involved with club activities and perhaps change your casting style. A special thank you to our bailiff team, headed by Brian Phillips. They give advice on the banks and keep an eye on poachers and trespass incidents. Andy Stafford forwards a monthly summary of poaching reports to the Amesbury Police. This appears to be having an impact. Our year end is October, and Andreas has been assembling the figures. As a non-profit operation, we budget to produce a moderate surplus, which goes directly to our reserves. As you know, we are in high inflationary times, so the Finance Committee will need to take this into account before the club subs are announced at the AGM on January the 11th. During the year, sdac received 2 legacies, one from Linda Ashley for £1,000. I believe Mike is listening, so thank you, Mike. And £10,000 from Elizabeth Watson, who fished at Stapleford for many years. It is particularly pleasing that members give back to the club in this way. Both amounts will be ring-fenced. So I'll now hand back to Andreas. So enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You must realize that we decided to have all speakers in the office. The background is not my usual background, but we decided to have a more, beautiful setup, which is the back of Salisbury Cathedral. And I'm sure a number of you have fished that lovely stretch. So good evening all. Just a couple of things on the admin. You should be able to see us and you should be able to hear us. We're not able to see you nor hear you because fitting 160 screens on however big a screen is nigh impossible. If you wanted to ask any questions, please use the question and answer button. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session. So I hope you're having a glass of your favorite drink ready. Just relax. And I'm just going to very quickly run through the agenda. John Stoddart, our Vice Chairman, again, he will go through the highlights of the season, talk about returns, catches, talking about projects, talking about maintenance, etc. And then after John, we will have Dave Holroyd, who is the lead of the water quality team for SDAC and the Wiltshire Fisheries Association. There's a lot of work which the water quality team has been doing. We have 3 members. Dave Holroyd is the lead. We have Tom Putnam, who is a volunteer barrister who does a lot of legal work for the club, and also Patrick Heaton-Armstrong, who has been 40 years in the water industry. So I'll let I'll let Dave talk about more about what they've been doing. Last but not least, we have 2 young members, Peter Christensen, who is Danish and has been studying anthropology, and he's a very, very keen fly fisherman. He's fished in many parts of the world. And our member, Jack Hogan, who is an historian and equally a fly fishing aficionado. I hope you have seen the film which I attached on the invitation. They're going to give us some context. They're going to give us their views, having fished both sides of the spectrum, having fished the test, which is the traditional fly fishing, let's call it Holy Grail at the turn of the century. That's the one side of the extreme, and the other side of the extreme, fishing in Lapland, being eaten alive by mosquitoes, which is the other extreme of wild fishing. And you've heard about this word rewilding, which is used a lot these days. So we will hear their views about how they see the whole thing. After the ad lib conversation, we will go into the Q&A session. So please enjoy your evening, and I would like to invite John to walk us through the season's highlights. And I'm going to put the presentation on the screen so John can start his session. Thank you very much and enjoy yourselves.
Yeah, John.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, members. I'm John Stoddart, Vice Chairman of the game section of the club, and have been for 10 years or so now. And this might be about the 10th game presentation that I've done, though only the second that I've done in this particular format. Let's get myself sorted out and we'll make a start. What we usually do is to run through some of the highlights of this season and some of the projects that we've been doing, but members are usually very interested in the catch returns, which we have managed to get done in time as usual, and you'll see later on in the presentation. So away we go. This year has been one where we've been returning to normality after a very difficult year with COVID in 2020. We were able to start the season on April the 1st this year, in contrast to last when it was June the 1st. Fishing was permitted by the government, but there were still travel restrictions, and working from home was only just being eased. This year, in contrast with last, the membership started to renew early, and it meant that we all felt quite a bit safer than we did last year in terms of the club's finances. We did quite a bit of work to get people who were hesitant to sign up last year. So early membership renewals were a good feature. We've had very little turnover, fewer than 100 new associate member invitations this year, partly because we've been keeping the numbers down a little bit in order to ease the pressure on the water, and partly because people are simply not surrendering their membership. Club administration earlier in the year was being done remotely. Club manager Andreas was up in Cobham, and through magical means, computers, post, this, that, and the other system, we were able to get the books out on time. And the main person I have to thank for that is my wife, who certainly wouldn't have been possible without her. Early season for the members was prolonged and cold weather, but the members did turn out in good numbers. We had a very good early Granham hatch, with noticeable hatches of Granham at Durnford, Amesbury, Stonehenge, as well as the usual sites down in the town on the mixed waters. This is a real pleasure to us, because this has been a project ongoing for some time, with Granham eggs being transplanted, brought upstream to those sites, and a new population of Granham now firmly established on some of our Upper Avon waters. There was a surprise big stocky caught on April the 1st. Not such a surprise, because I think it had been spotted in the winter months. 9 pounds 4 ounces. We'll talk more about that fish later on. It was an unremarkable mayfly season, as many have been lately. But we had busy beats during mayfly. A lot of our members only come during that period, and there were fish caught everywhere with some very good returns. Mid-season, we saw the usual drop-off in visits. Always lots of space on the water in the summer. And this is the time when we combine the beats at Durnford to give a bit more generous water to each angler. The hatches this year, I've talked about the Granham, really good Granham hatches on the Avon and on the Nadder, though the Granham can be fickle. I describe it as being as good as the mayfly, but it's not as easy as the mayfly. And sometimes you could be on the water with fish rising everywhere and you can't hit a single one. The trick might be knowing exactly where they're taking the fly in the water column. We didn't see many, if any, hawthorn flies. And as I've said, an average but prolonged mayfly hatch, which has been a feature for some years now. We don't see those very prolific May-June hatches that we once did, but we do see them trickling on much longer into the season. The spinner falls in the evenings in the summer were again average, not as heavy as we've seen, but sufficient. And fishing, in common with quite a few recent years, has moved into the dusk for the most productive period. The pale wateries and the olives in autumn were there. The pale wateries are the tiny little white flies that rise slowly off the water, and they seem to be becoming more common now. That is a slide showing the Granham down to the south of Salisbury, just over the Harnham Road Bridge, and it's just below the road bridge where we collect the eggs. And this is where the flies are rising up to either cross the bridge and go upstream, or, as they have often done, head up towards the hospital following the road. So, maintenance. All of our beats are given a 3-week haircut by the keeper team, Paul and Sticky, aided by casual workers, Chris Thomas and Al Flower, and occasionally myself. That 3-week haircut involves cutting the grass on the paths. It involves trimming out some places to land your fish. It involves trimming down the bankside growth. Nowadays, avoiding cutting off the flowering heads, which we used to do with gay abandon. We've got a much more varied fringe now as a result, and a few more complaints about there being a bit too much fringe, but it's all the better for it. This year's bankside growth has been unbelievable. Even the 3-week trims have barely kept up. I was at Sutton Venie Fishery early in the season helping with the mowing, and was travelling in the opposite direction to Chris Thomas, who was on another mower coming up the path, and I didn't see him till he was nearly on me. The growth was so high. In between these routine visits, the keepers are involved in dealing with seats, gates, wading steps, backcast areas are cleared, fallen trees dealt with, where possible pinned into the river. Weed cut this year, we completed on schedule. We had the boat out, we have a contract boat hire arrangement, and we cut what we had to cut by hand, but the weed growth was relatively small compared to some years. In fact, very little weed reached the Environment Agency's boom south of Salisbury, and I don't think we cut very much weed at all in the second weed window. It's something that's quite unpredictable. I wrote a lot about the weed cut in the summer newsletter to try and give some people some more detail of exactly what's behind that. It looks a very simple process, but it's far from it. This year's projects, the keepers, the club, have worked with Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, ranunculus planting at Durnford. That was, Wildlife Trust had some money to involve soldiers who were about to leave the service in outdoors type of work, and they planted a lot of ranunculus for us. The Wildlife Trust also worked with us on removing invasive species on the Norton Bavant beats. That was Himalayan balsam, organised by our keeper, Paul Clancy. A lot of weed pulled on that day. The trust have also been involved with ourselves and Durrington Council in doing some bank repairs and habitat work at the Durrington beat. We've done a lot of survey and planning work with Wessex Rivers Trust. This is more towards future projects if ever we get back to a situation where river restoration funds become available. That is looking at some big projects around the A303 and other sites where perhaps some more extensive engineering work might be required. Our own in-house project, we've talked about the bank stabilisation at Amesbury. This is coming down off the South Mill track, where there's been a lot of bank erosion caused by people coming off the track and dogs in particular. It did prove a little controversial with some people, but basically we've installed some live willow along that bank, which has taken quite well, much to the consternation of some dog walkers who think they can put their dogs into the water while we're fishing. Our biggest project this year has been the completion of the swamp path below Sleeper Bridge and heading down to Moor Hatches, where we put a lot of willow brush down and covered it with a layer of chalk. So we in effect have a floating path, giving us better access to the Moor Hatches beat. And we've continued to do a lot of work in the woodland we acquired at Amesbury. We've created some glades, a picnic site for members. There's a lot of work been done with wildlife interests, cataloguing what we've got up there. We've completed a return path and most recently a wildlife pond on that site. Next year we have a few projects in mind, but we're not looking to do too much because we recognise it could be an expensive year for us. But we are going to look at the fences below Ham Hatches. We're going to continue with the bank repairs at Amesbury, installing more willow. And we are thinking about a hut or a lodge at Amesbury, which is in the design process, which may be one of the ways that we spend some of that legacy money that Robert has referred to. Those pictures are the path through the swamp below Sleeper Bridge. Anybody who tried that path beforehand and sank up to their waist will know what that was like. We cleared through there, cleared all that willow to make that gap, laid it down on the ground, put a geotextile on top and chalk on top of that, and you could even feel it moving when you drove the dumper over it. It's definitely a medieval style floating track, but does allow much better access to that beat, and particularly to the middle section of that beat where we had a gravel berm installed some years ago. Just 2 weeks ago, I think there was a storm, the wind blew, and I mentioned the keepers doing tree work. I mean, these are just 2 examples of what happened that morning. Both of these are at Amesbury. The right-hand picture shows the entrance and a thorn that's fallen right across it there. And the left-hand picture is a massive lump of oak that came off the side of the woodland and landed on the football field, along with another ash that we had to clear up pretty quickly. So there was 2 or 3 days work just on that site alone, out of those few hours of storm. Stocking. No change to our stocking policy and numbers. Everybody will know we've changed our stocking policy dramatically over say 10 years. We were stocking something like 10,000 fish into most of our beats. We now stock 2,000 brown trout up to around the kilo mark. We stock them into areas that we describe as being poor trout habitat and or high fishing pressure. We don't stock them into all those areas where we know the wild trout are doing pretty well. So in real terms, that means they go into Durnford, they go to Amesbury. Amesbury largely because of fishing pressure rather than habitat. They go to the Abbey, they go to Countess Ratfin, and we've continued to stock on the Wiley at Stapleford. Our stock fish have come from Manningford Fish Farm last year and this, and they've been of good quality, good looking fish. And the best thing about those stockies is that they have been willing to get caught. And you'll see later on in the numbers that we seem to be catching more of Manningford's trout than we caught of the previous supplier's trout. So that has to be a bargain for us. As a result of concerns about the number of stock fish surviving, we decided to do some electrofishing at Durnford to get better data on stock fish survival, and a few other reasons as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We have seen some very big stockies, the one referred to earlier, and at least another one caught, and these will be eating small fish and impacting on our wild stock. So we wanted to know if many of those very big stockies are surviving in our water and where they are. We don't want too many, and maybe the mild winters are allowing better survival rates and feeding has been good. We felt we needed to understand this better. So there they are, 2 of the monsters. On the left, we see a fish that is definitely a Salisbury Angling Club stockie. It had a yellow tag. It had been in the water 2 to 3 seasons. It had grown to 9 pounds 4 ounces from its stocking weight of something like 2 pounds, which is a phenomenal, unheard of growth rate. How did it get to that size? Was it fed by the local residents? There's some houses nearby. Did it go down to the estuary to feed itself and return? We've certainly had stock fish caught down in the Christchurch harbour, so it may have done that. Was it a pure cannibal? Had it eaten a lot of our wild trout? It was a good looking fish. You can see that it's got a decent body taper to it, and it fought like hell. In contrast, the one on the right was caught by one of our members, not far away. it looks typical of a fish that's come straight from the fish farm. It's not a Salisbury Angling Club stockie, though it was caught on our water. It didn't have a tag or any sign of a tag. It looks like it's a this year's introduced pellet-fed fish. It was bigger than the one on the left-hand side of the picture, but it barely fought at all. It used its weight and went to the bottom and plodded round and round in circles. So that's two of the fish that we've got in the water, or that we had in the water. How many of those have we got? What damage might they be doing? And so consequently, the decision to try again electrofishing, and here we are. We used to electrofish every year in the autumn, and we used to do it because we wanted to remove the coarse fish from the trout waters, and we used to take out the pike as well, and we used to leave it purely for the trout to grow on and enjoy themselves. Now that probably meant that the trout were the only thing that the pike and cormorants had to eat. And after a little while, we decided that that wasn't a good thing, and we haven't done it for a great many years. But we kept our equipment, and we have now gone back to use that for survey purposes. And so we got permission to electrofish on the basis that we wanted to find out about those big stockies. We wanted to make some assessment of their survival. We wanted to look at the general health of the stock in the river. We'd be looking for diversity. And we wanted to look at some before and after results from changes to the management regime on the river, in particular on beats 11 and 15. We may not have done much, but what we have done is open the hatches. Opening the hatches on that beat has made an enormous difference. It takes 5 minutes to open them, but the difference it makes to the flow and the general condition of the river above the hatches has been dramatic. So there we are. Looking at the picture, you'll see two guys out in front in dry suits, yellow shoulders. That's our two keepers. They're carrying the electric probes. Looking just behind them, you'll see a netsman. That's Dom Longley, one of our committee, also a fisheries expert who works for the Environment Agency and a real addition to the team on the day. You'll see another netsman behind him. That's Mervyn. One hidden behind the boat. That's Al. We needed another netsman really to make this work. 7 people can barely manage on the day. And you'll see 2 people managing the boat. That's Chris Thomas and myself, just keeping the boat in line and making sure that everything stays under control, operating the generator, looking after the fish in the tank. The tank we've got there isn't ours. It's borrowed from Manningford. But we have got a new tank and new oxygen equipment, which we were using on the day. Just there, you can see a little bit of wood sticking up, and on the other side of that is the oxygen meter, which is feeding the tank and helping to keep the fish alive. And we process in that format. Actually, there were 2 other people, I must mention. They were on the bank. It was Andreas and it was Andy, and they were doing the recording. And probably taking this picture as well. So on we go. This is some of the results of the captures from 11 and 15. 11 and 15 we would have thought were degraded beats until we did that hatch opening exercise. And now looking to the top left, a beautiful wild brown trout. The grayling on the right, we'll say more about them later, a chub, a lovely roach and a dace. And that wasn't all. There were salmon parr, there were gudgeon, there was perch, some lovely perch in that water. And the comment from our EA expert was this biodiversity is extremely healthy. We will publish the numbers of fish that we actually got separately to this. But this is probably what we got out on that one pass through was reckoned to be about 10% of what was in the water. So given that, it was a very healthy stretch of water. We got a few stockies as well, normal size this year's stockies. When we went up onto beat 16, we were expecting it to be different, and indeed it was. And there we did see 1 or 2 bigger trout. We saw some pike, we saw chub, and not many trout at all. But then again, it isn't very trouty water. So it was as we would expect it to be, really. Moving on to our trout lakes. 2 rainbow lakes in the club's portfolio, both south of us, New Forest. 2 years ago, I think at our last face-to-face game meeting, we talked in detail about these lakes, and members have been telling us that the catches were becoming very poor, and indeed they were. And we put together a management plan to try to bring those 2 lakes back into decent form. And that involved a rather controversial closure of both lakes during the 3 months in the summer, partly because we're very busy elsewhere at that time, but also because when we were stuffing fish into shallow, still waters in the summer months, they were dying. And we thought it wasn't the decent thing to keep on doing it and to keep on fishing them for them. Actually, that period of rest seems to have done, or 2 years now, seems to have done the fishing no end of good. Bottom picture shows us putting barley straw into the lake, which is to suppress algae. That's what we've done at Leominster. We've got ourselves new tanks and oxygen equipment for better fish transport. We were finding that the fish going into Leominster were not surviving the shock of going into that water very well. We've taken a lot of invasive weed out of Hamer. We do that every year. This season has started with some very strong catch returns at Hamer. And Leo is now back in operation after our first stocking, when we had a small fish kill, and certainly the fish that we did put in were fairly moribund. We didn't see them, and what we did see weren't looking well, so we didn't open that for a further 3 weeks. We need to talk about the use of the game lakes and to keep our eye on that. The running of the game lakes is not cheap. Per member visit, it's our most expensive offering in the club's portfolio. Last year's usage of the game lakes cost us £25 per visit. It's 1,200 visits between the 2 lakes, roughly 600 each, and approximately £30,000 in costs. That keeps us just about viable against commercial interests, where the alternative for a 2-fish ticket is probably around about £40. It's a bit of a numbers game running these rainbow lakes. We don't want too many people fishing for the number of fish that we've got, otherwise the costs start to escalate. But we do want the usage to be spread amongst as many members as is possible. We don't want it to be good for a few, but not very good for the many. As I said, it's our most expensive offering. At the moment, the numbers justify the lakes, but we do need to keep a close eye on what we do there. The Academy. Let me find my notes on the Academy. I've lost it. There we are. The Academy was started in the club and is being run by one of our committee members and a game fishing instructor, Chris Kent. We've often had conversations about the catch rates in the club and how 20% of the members catch 80% of the fish. And we've often had conversations about members returning from the rivers telling us there are no fish in there. We've always said it's skills, members have always said it's no fish. So we started the Academy in order to address some of that skills deficit. We found there was overwhelming demand for these places on the courses. We had more than 80 registrations. We ran 3 groups of 6 members with 2 instructors, and we had incredibly positive feedback from the teaching, which you can see was held in the cart shed, and the instruction, which was done on the bank in the afternoon. We're going to continue the courses into 2022. There'll be an introductory course, there'll be an early season course, and perhaps the Granham Hatch could be something that might be talked about there. And the late season chalk stream fly fishing, which might include the grayling, and some of the things we're going to talk about now. we'll let you know the dates when that is all planned, and I'm sure there'll be as much interest as before. Now then, what's all that about? We have seen questions on the forum. Our chairman observed somebody operating with one of these floats down the bottom. We've had questions as to whether we may use indicators on the water, bearing in mind we are a traditional fly fishing club. And Andreas has prepared this slide, which, moving down the page, goes through from top to bottom the most discreet of means of detecting a grayling bite, just a simple greased leader, through the leader loops or connectors, which are sometimes coloured. You can see those through coloured sections in the leader. There are other things. There are putties and stick-ons and twists of wool and all sorts of different methods, down towards the bottom where we get the floats. And they are quite clearly floats. They look like coarse fishing floats. We don't want to make rules, but we do have expectations as to how people will use that definition of traditional chalk stream fishing means. So for the vast majority of members, we'd expect they'd be operating up the top of this scale. They'd be using very little by way of indicators. Their choices would be discreet. At the same time, we recognise that we've got members fishing well into their later life, and that some of us don't see half as well as others. And if it keeps a member fishing till he's 90 or whatever, and he happens to use a float like the ones at the bottom, and he isn't actually using it as a float, but he's using it as an indicator, then we're not going to shout. But I do think it's about the ethos of the club, and our ethos is towards the top of the page, but we're tolerant of the bottom of the page, if there's good reason to be there. Moving on, the question was also asked, can we use two hooks? A few years ago, we did agree that after October the 15th, during the grayling fishing, we could use the clink and dink, or the New Zealand style of two hook rig, where fish might be caught on either, but the large dry fly is acting in a way as an indicator or float. So that is okay within the rules after October the 16th, for grayling, not throughout the grayling season, which obviously extends back into the trout season, but only in that latter part of the season. So that is just to answer some of those queries and to express the chairman's preference. So we move on to the catch returns. Highlights of catch returns: more visits compared to last year, quite a lot more. Last year was pretty poor. You didn't start fishing till June, and we didn't use the return books. The return books were kept out of the boxes so you couldn't transfer COVID to one another. We put them back in later on in the year. So we have quite low data for last year. We've got a full year this time. Overall better returns, that is in terms of the rod average. You're catching more fish per member than you did in 2020 and in the years before that too. It was at that last face-to-face game meeting when I talked about the grayling disappearing from our beats, and we were becoming quite concerned that we were struggling to catch and to find any grayling at all. We are now seeing an increase. They've had a good spawning year last year or this year anyway, and there are plenty of grayling back in the rivers. It is really quite noticeable in the returns that 10% of the anglers catch 50% of the fish. We always said 20% catch 80% as well. So some of the members don't touch the fish very much, and that's where the skills come in. Moving on through some examples now. Durnford is our premier fishery, our headquarters. You'll see that we had 1,510 visits to that fishery. We caught a good number of wild trout in line with previous years. We caught 384 stockfish, pretty good. we actually put something like 700 stockfish into the river. And they went in 5 batches, 200, 200, 100, 100, 100 throughout the year. You caught 384 of them, which is 55%. Hence my point earlier that they are willing to get caught. In previous years, we've not seen anything like that number. It might be the same fish over and over again, of course. Durnford also seems to be the place where the members who like to take a brace fish. So we've had 126 fish killed, hopefully all stockies, on that site, and that's always been where those that still want to do that find their brace, and that's fine. We're very happy that that should continue. You'll see there are at the bottom 31 yellow tagged fish. Those were the previous year's stockies. Those are all recorded in the early part of the season, and they've disappeared by the season's end. So although we've got some stockfish surviving through the winter, they're not lasting much longer than the next season. They may be providing a buffer against predation in the winter months, and it may be that we shouldn't worry about them too much. Lower Woodford, just upstream. Excuse me. We don't stock at Lower Woodford, so the stockfish that you see there are from the adjacent Durnford beats. 41 caught, so not as many have swum up as have done in previous years. 621 visits is about on par. 334 wild trout is good. 272 grayling is getting back to the numbers we used to see a few years ago, for a rod average of 1.04. Not great, but pretty good. West Amesbury, one of our busiest fisheries, second to Durnford. 1,282 visits, slightly less than Durnford. Look at the wild trout score, 1,045 wild trout caught, almost double what we've had before, although there were fewer visits in 2018. It's a good number. Stock trout 216. We actually put 485 in there, 130, 130, 75, 75, 75 went in. 216 is 45% of the stocked fish caught, of which you killed 102. You can kill all 216 if you want. We're happy to see them gone. Look at the grayling, a massive return of grayling at West Amesbury, which is very welcome, for a rod average of 2.27, which is excellent. Stonehenge generally returns well for the club. 375 wild trout is excellent, and 660 grayling is even better. A rod average of 3.48 is as good as it gets within the club waters. Stapleford and Druids, we're now on the Wiley. This fishery has been with the club a very long time. We've got both banks. Visits 481, so it's busier than it's been for some time. 584 wild trout is a great score for that fishery, a fishery which we did until recently describe as poor trout habitat, but it's been repairing itself without us doing too much work. It started to get back into a better condition. 117 stock trout caught. I forget how many we put in there. Let me just see if I can see. 175 and 69% of the stock trout caught. A good score. 201 grayling is again a good increase, and a 1.86 rod average. Wiley at Wiley, just upstream, a short stretch of the Wiley, 171 visits, no stockies. We don't stock the water. 172 wild trout, so one each. 52 grayling, 1.31. Decent return for that water. Eastleigh are very top beat on the Wiley. Small water, a delicate beat, is being visited more by our members. They're really enjoying the fishing there. No stock trout to buffer the catch. 371 wild fish, and it's fair to say some of them are of very good quality. And 101 grayling, another good score. 472 total fish for a rod average of 3.55. I've worried about Eastleigh because I think it's a delicate little water and it might get hammered. It's holding up extremely well. Bulbridge is the combined fisheries on the lower Nadder above Wilton. 298 wild trout is good, 75 grayling. Not much of an improvement on grayling on the Nadder yet. It doesn't look as if it's picked up there. 2.16 rod average. Barford St Martin, our little fishery in my home village, 107 visits is about par for the course. Tends to be an early season fishery. Very few grayling caught, and that's true of the Nadder as a whole. I belong to the Barford and Birkham Club, which fish 2 miles downstream. Almost no grayling this year. A rod average 1.14 is about par for the course for that fishery. Homington, new 3 years ago, was always going to be a difficult fishery, but members have tried it and they've done very well. Grayling, not very many there. Rod average 1.74 on a wild fishery with crystal clear water. You need to know what you're doing, so the members are catching well at Homington. 10 key fisheries, the overall summary. We've been monitoring this now for some years, so we've got very good data. Our visits are around about the number that we'd expect this year, right down in 2020. A good catch of wild trout. We haven't lost anything there. We've probably gained quite a few. 758 of the 2,000 stockies. There's a few more on other fisheries being caught as well. Look at the grayling. The grayling number is back up to where we have previously seen it. And the rod average across those 10 fisheries, 1.85. We're quite happy with that. That's about what we'd expect to see and about what you'd see in similar clubs. So that's the returns done. We will publish all that information as we usually do on the forum and on the website so that you can look at it in more detail. All the rest of the fisheries that I haven't mentioned tonight will be published there as well. This slide is headed Reflections, and you might remember that I wrote a piece in the newsletter and on the forum in the middle of the season. I wrote a caution really about a few stupid remarks and the impact that they have on the enjoyment and morale of our team and volunteers. Most people do this because they love it. They don't expect to be getting stick for it. A tiny minority of our membership, maybe not our members, maybe they're trespassers that come in and write stupid things in our books. There is a certain grace that accompanies our sport, and we don't expect to see those silly comments in our return back books or elsewhere. I think this often goes back to the issue of skills, blaming the club or the water for poor results. Read the yearbook, Chairman's already mentioned that, and read the newsletters in detail every time they appear, because things change. The rules on individual waters change, the dates, all sorts of things change. Please read the yearbook and have a good look at each page before you visit the fishery. We do set out very clearly what we offer as a club, and it shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody. Don't go expecting to catch stockies on wild water. Obey the rules. We're a traditional fly fishing club, supporting traditional fly fishing approaches, and all the info you need to follow that ethos is there in the yearbook. I commend Gordon Mackey's introduction to chalk stream fly fishing. As I said before, we're not against more modern methods, and anything that keeps a member fishing into his later years, we're for it. But let's try to be sticking to the traditions as far as we possibly can. A final slide, and a glorious one at that. Look at that. The grayling are back. That's great. They are, however, at their southern limit in these waters, and there is research on the Wiley that's showing that year on year they have some serious difficulties in spawning, and there are years when they go missing completely. And if they don't get a good spawning year, then being a relatively short-lived fish, they can appear to be dying out on the water. So the grayling are under threat. Beautiful fish. we had occasion to talk with our coarse fishing colleagues earlier in the season at one of our committee meetings, putting the point that we didn't want to see grayling in keep nets. We were swiftly reminded that we still have a rule that allows us to kill grayling. Grayling, once thought of as vermin on trout waters, have now achieved a status way beyond that, and are held in some reverence by sections of the angling fraternity. So as a result of that, we've made the decision that we will change our ways. And as from 2022 season, we will no longer allow grayling to be killed. That actually probably means nothing in terms of the numbers of grayling that are killed, because I don't think anybody is anymore killing and eating them. But we will move into the new world and we'll stop doing it. So there, that's it from me. Thank you very much. I'll leave you with that final picture and the happy news that the grayling are back. Thank you very much.
Well done, John. If I wanted to summarize John's excellent presentation, is to say, last year I made the comment that it was the year for the fish and the invertebrates, because the rivers were full, we were not allowed to cut weed, and the fish predominantly stayed deep. So it was nymphing time. This year, I can say it's the year where the anglers came back and the fish came back. And at last, I will stop using my slogan, no fish in the river, looking at the catch returns that John presented. So I would like to invite now Dave Holroyd, who, as I said earlier, he is the lead of the water quality team for SDAC and for the Wiltshire Fisheries Association, to tell us all or most of the things that they have been doing over the last year. So I'll prepare his presentation. There we are.
Dave, welcome.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm relatively new to this post, as Andres said, both in terms of SDAC and Wiltshire Fisheries Association. There was starting to be some concern about the quality of the water in our rivers, and in particular, a downward trend that we were experiencing from our kick samples, our invertebrate samples. So we put ourselves together about a year ago, mainly to respond to the government's request for evidence in relation to what is now the Environment Bill. We actually used a case study of around West Amesbury of the deterioration of the water life at that time in providing that evidence. And that was quite successful. But what it did do, that certainly was gel that the core team that we now have, that's done quite a remarkable amount of work. What I would like to do is just set the scene in terms of SDAC for a required number of years has been part of the Smart Rivers project, which is run by the Salmon and Trout Conservation. This is a national programme that's putting together. It involves taking samples of invertebrates in spring and autumn, and where the whole population is counted, unlike the normal kick sample where we would just take samples. So this is very detailed and gives us much more indication in terms of water quality and any changes that are taking place. Now, what I'd like to do is just take you through the next few slides, which are really about telling a story in terms of what's happening to our rivers, and in particular the Avon. So these are the sites currently within the Smart Rivers programme, and we have benchmarking data going back many years in terms of this. And this data has been put together with great thanks to Dr. Cyril Bennett, who has been doing a real Trojan job in terms of keeping this program alive and keeping all of the information that we've got and the quality of the information we've got. But without going into a lot of detail of these individual sites, I think you can see as we go through here over the years, the deterioration that we have seen, and it's from every single one of the sites. There's this general, this downward trend. There are some ups and downs in between, but it's a steady deterioration. Now, that's quite a staggering kind of an event, and we have in 2017 we approached the Environment Agency with a request for action in terms of to try and find out what was actually happening in this particular area, and that has been ongoing. And one of the things that we have done this year is that we returned to the Environment Agency and said, look, this trend is still continuing. If anything, it's steepening. So we need to do something about it. We had a meeting actually with them yesterday about this particular matter, and I think it's fair to say that the meeting was quite constructive. One of the things that we have been talking to them about are phosphate levels, and this is work that we have done in terms of pulling together the data, which is the amount of phosphates that's going in through sewage treatment works. And you can see again, it's quite a staggering increase that's going forward. In terms of this is the total load that's going in. Now, following on from the discussion that we had with the Environment Agency, we've also been doing a lot of work with other outside bodies with a view really of putting a case together for, in particular, improvement works to be carried out at the sewage treatment works at Ratfin. This seems to be the key element that we can see as being an area for improvement. So in that past year, we have done a number of things. We have approached Wessex Water and their environmental director, so we've got good working relationship with them. They've been very helpful, in fact, in terms of providing data. They totally sympathise and understand the problems that we are having. We've also worked a lot with the Wessex Rivers Trust, Wiltshire Wildlife. We have also engaged Professor Peter Hammond, who you may have recalled from a BBC Panorama programme, which looked at sewage discharges into UK's rivers. Now, Peter Hammond at the moment is modelling sewage discharges for all of the sewage treatment works in the Avon catchment area. This is going to be really valuable information for us as we start to look beyond the current Ratfin problem and we start to look elsewhere. We also involved ourselves with Wiltshire County Council, who are also been looking at restricting developments and particularly trying to create offsetting arrangements for these phosphates that come out of additional loading from housing developments. The other thing that's happened also with our work with the Environment Agency is the trigger levels have been increased on the Avon rivers. This is quite important for us because this will make the monthly kick samples that we do take much more sensitive to the various changes that take place. So this will enable us both to work much more closely to individual problems as they arise. As well as looking at sewage treatment works, the group has also worked together to try and inform farmers as well where they can help with regards to phosphates and also nitrates going into the water. We've also tried to look at the locations and problems with septic tanks with Wessex Water as we're starting to put this information together to get a much bigger picture. On a national front, there is also now a new chalk stream strategy, which has just been launched. And I was fortunate enough to be able to see that launch, which was received by the Environment Minister and also the CEO of the Environment Agency. This is quite an important document, which I hope will be embraced, because what needs to happen is that chalk stream status needs to be changed. It needs to be seen as being more vulnerable to particularly effluent discharges and requires different standards. Charles Rangeley Wilson has put an enormous amount of effort into creating this document, but it will only really be successful if we can manage to get particularly the government and the Environment Agency, to start to see chalk streams as being a special case. So that really covers what has been really quite a very hectic year in terms of what we've been doing here. And we will continue to work with the Environment Agency, and particularly start now to move our concerns forward to Ofwat. Ofwat are very important here because Ofwat principally have the money to create the solution. So we are working with the Environment Agency now to be able to share data and to build up a case for that capital investment at Raffin. We're continuing the dialogue with Wessex Water, and we will build further joint initiatives throughout the catchment area, not just around West Ainsworth. The trigger levels have been increased, which increase the level of sensitivity that we can do and bring much more closer attention to what's happening in and around that area. We will also continue to build relationships with the key stakeholders, such as the farming advisors and Wessex Rivers Trust. This is an important aspect because the farmers have an opportunity to lock phosphates into the land by various means, which then prevent them getting into the rivers, along with nitrates and other pesticides and other problems that might cause problems in our rivers. We're also starting to build relationships and lobbying with our local MPs, and we're also getting them support in that area. So that might be something that we can report on in a little bit more detail maybe next year in terms of where we are, because we see this as quite a long-term project. It's going to be 5 to 10 years before we can really start to see this situation turning around. So we know that we're in for the long run, and we know we've got good solid data from both Smart Rivers and also the club's databases, so that we can make fact-based decision making and recommendations as the basis of that. So we're in a strong position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to thank again the water quality team for all they have done and all they keep doing. I can see that what sets us apart is the fact that we are totally action-based. It's a very, very difficult and frustrating game, and many a time you just feel like saying, what's the point? It just feels like banging your head against a brick wall. But we can't just let things go. This is when we cannot allow anyone to grind us down. So we will continue this journey. It will be a shame to turn around and accept defeat and say, oh, well, after all, the only thing we can do is start putting more stockists, allowing old methods, and our members can come and fish these pristine rivers that are turning into muddy waters. So I would like now to invite the two protagonists of the film which we sent to you on floating flies. I'll ask them to sit side by side. I haven't prescribed what they're going to talk about. I'm sure you will recognize who is the English aristocrat, although he may not like the term, and who is the fearsome Viking. So the only question which I will ask them just to start the conversation and hear their reflections is how they decided to make the film and what's the current feeling, what's the current reflections. Those guys, they fished, as I say, the two ends of the spectrum. So welcome, Jack, and welcome, Peter. Take your seat.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. The benign Viking. Here?
There you go.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
There you
go.
Well, can I start out?
Yeah,
by
crack
presenting
on.
myself?
I'd just like to thank you for that really charming introduction, Andreas. Well, crack on.
Oh, do you want
No,
to
no,
start?
no, I haven't got anything
Okay.
to say at all.
Well, my name is Peter. I'm from Denmark and mad fly fisher. And I'm also an anthropologist who have been studying chalk streams for quite some years now. Currently, I'm doing a PhD at Oslo University as part of a research group called Global Trout, where I got, through corruption and a lot of palm greasing, a PhD position. So they're paying me to hang out over here in the home counties and looking at chalk streams. I can say that in the last autumn, I spent a lot of time in Norfolk with Charles Rangeley, who we just heard about, following his rather incredible chalk stream restoration of the Nar, a small chalk stream in that part of England. And now I'm with a local company called Kane Bayer, who does restoration projects around Wiltshire, Hampshire, and Berkshire at the moment. And they've also managed to Shanghai Jack into a position. So over to you.
Hello, yes. So I'm Jack Hogan. I'm described in the film and by Andreas as a historian. I should say I'm a sort of recovering academic now. So although I was formerly, now I'm also working in river restoration, which has been quite an exciting thing to do. So I don't know if there was. I mean, what are we actually going to talk about?
I don't know.
Were there some questions, Andreas? Or
yeah,
I mean,
so
from
the
people
story
who've seen
about
it,
the
or?
floated, so we're also in that silly movie that our friend
Right.
Rolf made.
So how was it made? Yeah.
It was made, well, I just handed in my master's thesis, which I had written in Jack's mom's house in Stratford Tony on the Ebble, an appropriate place to write about chalk streams. And Rolf came over and we filmed here for a couple of days and showed him, I guess, the best of the chalk streams and the worst, or at least some of those more sort of hard-handed, stocky-filled parts of the chalk streams that tend to provoke pure Scandinavians like me. And I guess if anybody who saw the movie has any questions or would like to ask about anything, I can say I'm happy to answer anything related to chalk streams, or also my pet topic, the globalization of the brown trout from the chalk streams during the 19th century, where stocking became not just a local matter here in Wiltshire, but a global matter, as chalk stream trout were stocked pretty much everywhere. And the funny coincidence, which is not so coincidental, is that the first river in the southern hemisphere, or at least in New Zealand, to get English trout was called the Avon, and they were stocked in Christchurch. So it's a story that is a globalization story intimately bound up with these local landscapes and the recreation of ecologies for our sport.
Yeah, I don't know how questions would appear in chat at the bottom or something.
Is
I
it
think
at the bottom?
there is a chat.
Is it
And the Q&A
button? Is that
Yes.
is that the one?
And maybe there are some that are.
Any plans?
We can. I mean,
Here we are. There's a question for Peter. Peter, how have your views changed about the English chalk stream since you've arrived? What is your definition of a wild fish?
Oh, thanks, Hans. I guess when I first arrived to England, like many other fly fishers, I had inherited a lot of mythologies from the chalk streams. It is, after all, where the sport was invented, and I had heard about the gentlemanly code and about the gin clear water and about the sporting spirit, but nothing had prepared me for the amount of artificiality at the heart of making this fishing possible. So I should say my first gig over here as an anthropologist was, we rely on something called the ethnographic method, where you basically go and hang out with people to figure out how they see the world and what their everyday lives is about. And I started hanging out with river keepers on the test. And interestingly, most of the river keepers I met were deeply conflicted about this theater they had to put on all throughout the trout season, where every week or two, big large stockies would go in, and every day a gentleman or two would pay 500 quid to go try and catch them. And I also experienced the river keepers sort of itching for reform, but often the sort of big economy of the chalk stream kept them from implementing the kind of quite simple ecological improvements and solutions that they knew how to do, but nobody really wanted done, because, you know, if you increase the velocity of the river, it's bad for the stockies or whatever, you know. So the river keepers were kind of staging this play out and day in and day out, and deeply conflicted about it. And so was I, because I think most of us go fishing to sort of escape city or everyday life and get closer to nature. But yet, at least here in the chalk streams, for the last 150 years or so, the artificiality and technology and domestication has been sort of the foundation of the sport. So wrangling with that paradox, and also the paradox that these mythological rivers, the Test, the Itch, and the Kennet, are in some stretches, and I guess in a cynic's point of view, dying to some extent, and that there is such a massive cleanup job. We heard about the sewage pollution problems, and there are the deeper sort of archaeological problems of the whole structure of the chalk streams, where so much gradient has been lost to water mills. And there are the sort of paradoxes very close to the sport, right, that there are trout hatcheries impacting the chalk streams all along them, and many of them produce trout artificially for our sport. I know not the sdac club so much anymore, but basically how at the very heart of the sport is all this violence done to the ecology and the landscape. And that's something I've struggled with, because I'm a sportsman myself, and I find that the English tradition has so much, has given me so much, basically been a driving force in my own life as I've followed trout around the world, and fished for them in New Zealand and Patagonia, and enjoyed that a lot, but also inheriting all these dubious legacies, and how to sort of square that one's biggest love in life is also part of these very troubling traditions. So I find that an ongoing problem that I'm trying also to think about academically in my PhD work.
I suppose sort of for me, I didn't actually start fly fishing on the chalk streams, but in South Africa. And there it was totally different in terms of the amount of space you had, in terms of obviously the species as well. But, you know, the sort of ability to roam, and also to be in places which were, although impacted by dams or other things, not so sort of heavily populated and sort of polluted. And first coming to the chalk, before I joined sdac and had the opportunity to fish some of these beats, I fished sort of basically blasted ditches on the Avon or other places where it's, you know, a cheap day ticket. And I just thought, what is this? Like, everyone's been so excited that I was going to go and see it, you know, and be living there. And yeah, there are, you know, still contrasts, but I totally understand what Peter means about the fact that there's this kind of tension in this sort of performative fly fishing, you know, in sort of artificial picturesque landscapes. That's, I think, for me, the appeal of more wild fishing.
There is a good, Jack, there's many other questions here that we'll move on to. Also, Andreas, let us know when to stop our ranting. Peter asks, is your point of view that the UK has bigger problems with river pollution than other parts of Europe? So I think I can say that Denmark and England share that they are at the bottom list of pretty much every biodiversity measure done. So we fumbled ourselves down to last Denmark sometimes is worse, sometimes it's England on these global listings, but Denmark struggle with, I'd say, comparable problems to the UK. On the good news front, massive river restoration projects have been done in Denmark that have secured, amongst other things, a quite extraordinary return of a wild Atlantic salmon run. So we've gone from near extinction to 25,000 wild fish population in Denmark, I think. So that's, I think, one of the most powerful cases for doing kind of heavy-handed, large-scale river work, because it brings back these sort of kind of miraculous possibilities of, for instance, seeing salmon back in large numbers. There is something else here. Club manager asked, how do you see rewilding happening in chalk streams? How far can you go? We're both new in this company that I think is pragmatic in their approach.
Yeah, I think
They're
that'd be the right way to put
doing
it.
projects where I sometimes feel like we should go for more, but where there are also so many constraints. Oftentimes it's the landowner that's causing the biggest problems, because mill owners in particular, who sit on this valuable gradient, are often very committed to their garden and to the chalk stream as part of a garden landscape, and that clashes with rewilding. And then you also have flood risks. But I will say that something like the story we heard before about the sluices, I think, is characteristic. There are like thousands of sluices all around the chalk streams that are impeding flows, and a massive loss of velocity there, and it takes 5 minutes to pull them out. And in some of the projects that I've been following, fisheries have kept the sluices in for a century, and keepers have passed them every day, and nobody's thought, like, what happens if we pull them out? And what they got when they eventually, in one place, the sluice gates collapsed in a flood, and what they got was half a mile of ranunculus rich, watercress covered, beautiful chalk stream that had been there for a century, and nobody had bothered to pull out the sluice gate. So I find stuff like that extraordinary. And I think for me, one of the biggest gifts of doing my research here has been really getting an appreciation of how river and landscape interacts, how natural hydrology works, and how, even though the chalk streams are some of the most humanly modified rivers in the world, it's possible to achieve quite extraordinary results. And a lot of the work that I've been following in that Charles Rangeley is doing, I would say, represents the edge of what is possible, basically because up in the Norfolk, there's very little consideration paid to fishermen. So when you don't put them into the equation, you can do one section where they've replicated a storm event where large trees has blown into the river all over, like crisscrossing the river everywhere. And I don't think I've ever seen as many wild trout in a habitat as there. I probably think that, like, there are over 100 individual per meter of chalk stream in many places, and it's a tiny little, like, Ebble-sized chalk stream. Other places that designing a whole new river channel because the historical channel is just so impounded or channelized or outdredged that there's no amount of large wooden debris or gravel that can really make it a functional hydrology again. And so last autumn I followed a project where basically taking two excavators and cutting a meandering snaking path over the floodplain, and reconnecting that with the river's flows, you get basically a full restoration of the natural hydrology, and you also can then reconnect the river with the floodplain and get some really valuable hydrological processes back in the landscape, so that in addition to improving habitat for insects and fish and ultimately fishermen, it also can help with carbon sequestration and bringing back increased biodiversity in meadow landscapes. So those are good tips for sdac funding applications to get going on projects on your own bits of river here, I hope.
No, I was pleased to hear that there was, plans. I've also heard from Wessex Rivers plans to maybe do things. I mean, that's something which I think, really should be pursued as much as possible. I mean, the short answer, I suppose, version of it is as far as you can possibly go, would be my answer. What about some other questions?
There is Ned Writer here. Isn't it true to say that chalk streams were an artificial human construct from the very beginning and throughout their history? Yeah, that is certainly true. Like by the time fly fishing comes onto the chalk streams, I would say as in the 19th century, and the sort of gentlemanly clubs are formed, and Halford comes down here from the Wandle in London, and Hampshire and Wiltshire really become the epicenter of fly fishing. Of course, the sport evolves on a deeply humanly modified river system, because prior to this, there's been the at least millennium-old history of watermills, and the floated meadow systems have been implemented on large sections of the chalk streams. And so, yes, fly fishing was born in a completely artificial environment, but born around the idea that only the fly was artificial, because the paradoxical thing is that even though they are deeply humanly modified, chalk streams have counted as nature in a deep literature, both in fly fishing and also by other authors, like Walter Scott, the great romantic, imagined paradise to have a trout stream running through it. So these chalky landscapes are really hard to get a grip on, like where nature stops and begins. But what I think is true is that some ecological historians argue that back in the pre-human times, the chalk streams were just this myriad of single channels, or it never formed a single channel, but just a myriad of small streams running through these boggy wooded wetlands. And I think there is some truth to it, but it's also not true that spring creek systems don't form large single channels. I mean, they eventually do. So I don't think this idea that if you rewild chalk streams, the aim is to get 1,000 small channels spread across the floodplain. That's not rewilding chalk stream. I think that's possibly a misinterpretation of the historical ecology, because I'm pretty sure they would have formed single channels or a few channels across the floodplain quite quickly as they emerged from the underground, as spring creeks do all over the world. Yeah, I think it's manageable to, or it's sensible to maintain like 1 or 2 or 3 major channels, not like 7 or 8 as the test is some places, and have put back sinuosity and like make sure that the rivers are as full as meanders as possible. And then, but the biggest problem with rewilding, I think the one that worries me the most, is the relationship with abstraction, because some of these rewilding projects or river restoration projects or whatever we're gonna call them are pinching channels to fit the flows, and the flows are low because of high abstraction rates. And if hopefully one day abstraction levels are, and like some sort of alternative water sources are found and implemented, then the channel will be too small for the river. So I think that's it's better to do it right now in accordance with whatever water there is, but we might have to enlarge the channels a little bit down the road if they stop abstraction half the water out of the aquifers.
Yeah. Does that tie in as a brief comment on to what you were saying?
Yeah,
that's about abstraction, I think.
Yeah, that's it. But most most of there's a question about water extraction in Denmark, but we have very little chalky landscape in Denmark, so it's not very comparable. But a good question otherwise. The club's chosen direction, looking at it from the outside.
I suppose I'm disqualified once again.
You're disqualified. Yeah. To imagine that a Viking asked for advice on how to run a gentleman's
In
club,
Wessex.
insisting on traditional
We remember
methods.
what you've done here. you
No,
know,
but
those memories run deep.
I could hear from the presentations that the club is actively engaged in reflecting on both the good and the bad of the traditions we inherit. And I understand there's been a great limitation in stocking. I think that's a very sensible way forward. I also understand that there needs to be room for 85-year-old gentleman who likes to have a nice, easy access piece of chalk stream. But I think in terms of the political pressure you're trying to pile, and in terms of the clubs sort of standing in the local community as a representative of chalk streams, I don't think. I mean, if you're not radically for improving the ecology, also if it's sometimes at the temporary expense of the fishery and the fishing experience, who's going to do it? I don't think there's anybody but the fly fishers who will really make a difference for the chalk stream. And I think there's a lot of wiggle room still to be even more ambitious.
If I can answer as an insider rather than an outsider.
Yeah, I'll let the insider talk, but I do applaud a lot of the stuff we heard today, and
absolutely.
I think of many exciting things going on. I like that you also work with as a political pressure group. I encourage a firm.
Yes.
Firm stand.
La lucha continua.
Yes.
Yes. I suppose, one of the reasons that I'm so pleased that I am a member, actually, having initially joined and then had access to all this wonderful water, although, I don't actually, considering I live quite close to fish as much as I want to, I forever seem to be busy with other things. I nevertheless always want to support the club, because I think that actually they can be a real force. We can be a real force. In the landscape, even the waters we've got access to, where we've got potential for direct influence. I think we have been doing things, and we can be doing more. But I think that there is a sort of a new waters fund, and money about restoration and all the rest. But I think if we can try and concentrate our efforts on doing this and leading the way and leading by example, then I think it's something where there's other people who are willing to go along. Everyone who lives around here knows what the chalk streams are, right? And everybody's heard the phrase gin clear. So even non-anglers, but people who are connected and around, could be doing. But we don't have volunteer days, as far as I know, in the sort of numbers where, say, with the Wiley Club, you can get, you do 3 or 3 days, and people are getting discounts on memberships, and bringing local members together and doing things actively on the water, I think would be a really sort of positive thing for also getting more members engaged and educated about sort of wild fishing and chalk streams. If we're trying to move forward together as a club, I think that the best way to do it is just to try and get everybody as involved as possible. I know it's not easy at the moment.
Oh, and it's a lot of fun playing in the river with
it is a lot of
large
fun.
trees and gravel and planting ranunculus and all this stuff. It's we have more questions here. Is this the last one, do you think? Or do we keep going? Okay. Here's one. What do you think the beavers will do to the chalk streams? I am very happy to chip in on that. I have one comment about beavers that I think where I speak as an angler, and just so before I became an anthropologist, I was really nerdy about my fly fishing and fished all the time, traveling around to salmonid habitats from Kamchatka to Alaska to BC to northern Norway so I'm like above average nerd, and I've traveled a lot, and my carbon footprint is way massive, a great shape. But what I did gauge from all these visits to diverse habitats is that every single vibrant habitat with salmonids in the northern hemisphere has beavers. And of course, the question is, what will beavers do on the chalk streams? And I think one thing they won't do is they won't recreate, like bring back velocity and meanders in the way that a large-scale human driven engineering project can do. In Denmark, the angling community is pretty anti-beaver, I would say, generally, like here. But I do think that it's a totally losing battle to be against beavers, because you're losing an obvious ally in your own hopes for a wilder chalk stream ecology with, for instance, the invertebrate decline. One reason for invertebrate decline is no doubt pollution and poor sewage treatment. But there are also other factors, like, for instance, the lack of wood in many chalk streams. And beavers put wood in chalk streams. And many restoration projects are putting wood in chalk streams. Like, wood is good for rivers. There's no doubt about that. And there's not enough of it. And it's even worse in Denmark. So this is a kind of patriotic matter to me as well. That's something I know from home, is that we have this terrible habit of pulling wood out of streams and rivers, and that's a bad idea. That's certainly something beavers can help with. And then I think they can also help create really good what is called fly habitat. So whenever you go to a beaver dam in Alaska or Kamchatka or northern Sweden, you'll notice that a lot of salmon parr hang around the beaver dams, right? And that they are a really good nursery habitat. So even though beaver dams do cause a temporary migration barrier, we should also remember that they're not sort of permanent structures. They do blow out from time to time, but these beaver dams will no doubt impede flows here and there and do create a more sort of flood-prone chalk stream landscape. But I don't think you should be as afraid of them as some people are. And I think it's a massive publicity and sort of PI issue to be calling for all these radical environmental agendas in terms of water companies and so on, and then not embrace bringing back endemic species that have not been gone for that long and that were eradicated by the same sort of aristocratic sportsmen that invented our culture. Isaac Walton has things to say about the otter as well that will make your toes curl. So we should probably as a sport acknowledge that until very recently we were the driving force behind driving many charismatic chalk stream species nearly to extinction, and some of them did go extinct. And that not the beavers was not the anglers, but
that was the hat.
That was a hat. Yes, the hat. Terrible habit. Anyway, so I'll finish on that note and just say we have a little bit to atone for as a community and as a tradition. So I think we should be a little, and we're missing out on a wonderful ally, which is this vibrant rewilding community of other nature lovers that we should be part of, not look at as the enemy, right? Surely we need allies in our shared struggle for a more biodiverse and vibrant English countryside.
I think that's really neatly tied together as a conclusion. So should we do? There's a few more things. Optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our chalk streams? I would like to say that I'm optimistic for a couple of reasons. One, that might be a natural inclination, but two, also I grew up on the Wandle in South London, which is the chalk stream on which dry fly fishing began, with the Carshalton Dodge, false casting, all of it emerges there. And it's only after that river is so heavily polluted by industrialization and, the mills that were on it, the heaviest working river in the Industrial Revolution, at least at the start, that many of the fly fishers came down here. But that river by 1960 was declared as an open sewer, But when I was living there from the early 90s, there were good fish in there. I remember my father catching like a 2-pound brown trout out of the bedroom window. I mean, you know, and then in '93 there was a pollution incident, and the river went white like milk and boiled, and it killed everything. And the river was dead. There weren't even gnats that year at all, which it was a really striking thing as a child. But I took you there, didn't I, Peter? When the first time you went, just before Rolf made that film, and took him there. And I mean, apart from the fact that there are, you know, massive ghost carp and koi and all sorts of things that people release into it, there are big wild trout there now, and other species as well.
Absolutely.
And this is a river which, you know, the water isn't even from the aquifer. It's all abstracted, used by the water company, treated at a processing plant, then released into the river at what, you know, has been taken as being the ideal water conditions for it. And although it runs through, you know, concrete and culverts and under roads and by buses, and there's runoff, there is still the possibility for a really sort of vibrant chalk stream ecology there. And if it's possible there in London, I mean, there has to be some future here, provided we can get people on board and people educated. How the Wandle was saved, but also all the local people. You know, there were things done in schools. There was a lot of outreach. You got people really to care. And off the back of what's been reported recently about sewage, and seeing those shocking figures. I mean, I live in Tisbury. The shocking figures coming out of there, 347 releases this year. I mean, it's scandalous, you know, and people are receptive, I think. So there is an opportunity, I think, for really building momentum. But the damage, as we saw from those slides about fly life, you know, a lot of it's been done. And when you drive around or walk around or fish around here, you can see old and new damage that's been done, scars in the landscape, weirs and sort of remnants and things where you can see there's perhaps an original channel. I mean, there are relatively small things that we could be doing, I think, and bigger things as well with sort of the Wessex River Trust and Wiltshire Wildlife to really ensure that that future is bright. Because if we, as other people have said, and I'll echo them, if we don't do something about it, when's it going to happen and who's going to do it? So I think it really behooves us to put all of our shoulders to it.
Oh, and it's such a delight to see some of these streams bounding back. So the last couple of weeks, we've opened up channels that have been dry for hundreds of years, where the water was stolen for a mill lead, and you put it in a digger and you dig out 30 or 40 yards and connect the river again, and suddenly you have this chalk stream channel just bubbling with life. And we did a channel that had been dry for I guess at least 200 years, and after I think 48 hours of flows, I counted 13 wild trout in 50 yards of river. So they were just instantly. So
you know, they found
miraculous.
it,
right? When we were doing that channel in Norfolk, this is another story I love. There was the digger was finishing the sort of snaking course of the channel across the floodplain, but it was still just basically mud and gravel. There was no water in it. And the kingfisher came flying down the valley and followed these newly dug meanders, sort of checking them out before the water even had gone in. So rather than flying a straight line, it flew in this winding passage to see the new river before it was even really born. So I think there is tremendous joy and pleasure to be had from that, and I think it's well worth doing. And also, I think it will create some, like if you can get external funding from some of these, for some of your beats to do like really spectacular large-scale stuff, the fishing experience is enhanced tremendously. It is so exciting to fish these restored chalk streams, because they basically move in a correct hydrological pattern, which is, you know, meander, riffle, meander, riffle, meander, riffle. So you get a challenging but sort of readable river structure that is a lot of fun to fish.
And you know, although there is, you know, in the sort of things they do with sort of for kick sampling of water, certainly there's a lot of detail goes into it. It's also sort of straightforward, right? The rivers need to be able to flow and to meander, and if the flow is right, then it also washes the silt out, and that's good for gravel, and that's good for weed. And what's good for weed is what we should care about, because what's good for weed is good for fly, right? And in the end, it sort of, it's rewilding isn't, although it benefits the fishing, of course it does, that's also something much more, you know, focused on the wider ecology, and that also brings bird life, as you said, the kingfisher and other things. And that's also, I think, a point where a lot of people who live around here would be really receptive to turning what they are jewels, you know, they're jewels in our valleys, and making them into jewels and getting people engaged. You know, I suppose there's the sort of question about sort of traditional And if you mean sort of traditional, like very heavy stocking, very heavy cutting, the club isn't doing that sort of thing. You know, in terms of a traditional approach to fishing, I don't know, I suppose having borne in mind what Peter had said about some of the crimes that have been committed against trout or for trout, actually, both here and also internationally, and you know, the fact that we ought to maybe be conscious of that, I do think that there is nevertheless something about that traditional ethos, if you want, talking about grace and courtesy and all the rest of it, where we should show respect for rivers and respect for the fish that we're catching. You know, attempt to do everything we can if we're fishing catch and release to handle fish properly. Attempt to show respect for the river where you are, you know, to just be conscious of what's around you. And I suppose if I could say anything that would be a good principle, it would be that every day on the water is a privilege. And so it should leave it better in some way than you find it. And whether that's collecting rubbish or taking flies out of trees, or it's volunteering, doing something with the club, or in any other way. I mean, I know I feel enough now that, you know, I'm now working on rivers because, yeah, I feel that, you know, I've had so much pleasure already from fly fishing, and if I can give something more back, then I really should, so that also others can have that and can see maybe in some way what I see about the real beauty of, you know, that ecology, that wildness. Yeah. Right.
Oh, there's some really good questions.
Really good
Here's
question.
one. Are the English labels of coarse and game fishermen a hindrance to the long-term ecological health of the British rivers? I think I was a coarse fisherman when I was growing up, and my biggest fan was Chris Yates, or my biggest idol was Chris Yates, and Terry Hearn of the coarse kind. So I speak on the matter without any prejudice, but with a little bias maybe.
A Viking and a traitor.
A Viking and a traitor, yes. My apologies. I think, like, when we look at carp fishermen, for instance, of the coarse community, and we look at some of those pay lakes, right, and how they put like giant carp from Romania or something into them, and we get like, because fly fishers are slightly revolted or disgusted by this, we get kind of the perfect image of what we ourselves are doing just with trout, right? But they are like doing these radical landscaping projects where everything is subsumed to the economy of carp and how to catch them, and you put in your body, and you're like, obviously it's like coarse fishing is generally bad for the ecology, and that's probably also certainly the case of fly fishing on the chalk stream generally, even to this day, probably, that it will probably, the chalk streams would be a lot better off without anglers. But then again, they are in a pretty desperate state. So I don't know. And that's definitely not only because of fishermen. So fishermen probably are just contributing slightly to a much bigger issue, right? But whether coarse and game fishermen as labels are hindrance to the long-term ecological health of rivers, I don't know.
Well, that's also a question that there are so many questions bound up with that. I mean, the fact, you recall when we were on the Wandle, and we were walking along with fly rods, and the chap came up to us and said, "Oh no, lads, you can't fish. It's a close season. My mate's just been fined, like, I don't know, it was a couple of £100 or something." And then sort of Peter sort of turned and said, what do you mean you can't, like, it's the mayfly? And it's like, no, but it's closed season, of course. And then Peter remarked that it wouldn't be extraordinary in other countries, that was something that was allowed.
Yeah, it's just so you know, like, well, background for this conversation is like in Denmark, it's unthinkable to have a season where coarse fishermen can't go out on the river because it's salmonids only or game only. I mean, that's just the way that the off season is set up here is just, I think, dictated by the trout season,
right? Yeah,
which is like an astonishing fact, right? That the fishing calendar of a particular group of people also happens to become law. But there we have it.
Well, I suppose there's lots of people in the upper and lower house who are fly fishers.
There has been, but yeah, and it's quite delicious for an anthropologist, because in most human societies, and certainly in totemist societies that have been studied a lot by anthropologists, social groups tend to take on the name of animals to distinguish amongst each other. But in England, it's the other way around, where social categories are projected onto animals. So you have this hierarchy of fish with the game and the course, and within the game you have a king and the prince, the salmon and the trout, and you even have a lady, the grayling. And so how there is this piscine hierarchy that works its way into law and management and landscape making, and our own hearts in that. Of course, I want to catch the trout and salmon. I don't care about any barbel or chop. I mean, I'm a total snob, even though I've spent years studying this academically, but I can't get out of my deep and abiding preference for salmonids. So yeah, we're slaves to the passions we inherit.
Right. Well, I think that's all the questions down to the bottom of the list that are here. So I suppose, well, thanks for
all the great questions. There are many
us.
that we didn't get around to, but there's some fantastic questions that we missed, unfortunately. But thank you all for
Peter will be returning back. We're sending you back in the longship, aren't we, to Denmark? But
yes.
Well, I'm also around, and so I'll be delighted to talk to anyone if I happen to encounter you on the waters or elsewhere. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. Tight lines.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. You've done an exquisite job. I promised that you were going to hear the unplugged version. It wasn't orchestrated. I did not use a chief whip. Some of the views were not probably exactly the same as mine. For example, beavers, but I think it's great to have these conversations because we're pushing the boundaries and we're looking in the mirror and we say, well, what can we do better? I'm just scrolling through some more questions that there may have been with regards to more club matters. Just scrolling down. There's a question with regards to mixed fisheries, if they can be waded after the 15th of December. The answer is yes. Mixed fisheries, the difference is that the channel is much wider. Because it is wider, it's unless you're a professional caster and you can throw 25, 30 yards of line to target the fish that they are on the opposite side, it's now impossible. So wading, yes, it is allowed with care. The flows, sometimes they can be deceiving. When you enter in the water, you have silty areas. So, but nevertheless, yes, with care, no problem wading in the mixed fisheries. And that's throughout the season, really. There's a question. Again, are there any plans to improve access at Laverstock? There's a good path on the east side that is owned by a community trust that might be an option for access. Do you want to take that, John?
Yeah. Laverstock isn't a fishery that we've put an awful lot of time into because we try to gauge our efforts according to the number of people that are using it. But of course, that's a double-edged sword. If we don't do much, then not many people use it. But there are other options at Laverstock, and we are thinking about it. It gets very little attention, and it's very, very wild. And it's the one water that is like that. So we're reluctant to make it too easy down there, but there will be some changes coming. We had some plans for this year that we haven't been able to get round to yet, and we'll start to look at them again.
Okay, we have a comment from Hans. So pleased to see the grayling coming back. My friends in Scandinavia, much like many anglers in the UK, think they are a nuisance. Would those anglers please herd those fish towards my fly? This is great. From Peter Collis, I had the pleasure of a couple of summer trips grayling fishing in Swedish Lapland on the Taverna, caught 99% of a lot of grayling on hawthorns, while English dry flies, in your experience, work on both chalk streams and freestone rivers of the wild north. We can't answer that because Peter and Jack have left. What I know is that I haven't fished in Sweden and Lapland. What I know is that terrestrials generally they're doing well. Things like willow flies and well, although that's not a terrestrial, but anything that drops from the water, the fish tend to be more opportunistic. These are sort of wild freestone rivers, fast flows, and I would say that generally that would apply to some of freestone rivers in the UK. From Joseph Montague, I noticed that rather than simply stalk the fish, that you were actually quite often knowing where fish might be and target that area. How do you select the locations, and do you move on if you miss a take and target another location? It's a very good question. What you tend to find is that in the early part of the season, particularly, the hatches, they're very, very sparse. They're very, very localized. Now, fish know that, and obviously they concentrate their live and they wait for their food in areas where the early hatches will take place. Granum, for example, they're well-established places which they're typically shallow areas with fast flow, with ranunculus, because that's where they're hatching. Now, fish know that. Now, you heard earlier that typically in a river, on any river, you have meandering, sort of slow-moving sections and faster sections. So when it is advisable to understand exactly where food is served, what time it is served. In the case of Granum, going back to this, it's typically from about 12 to 2 o'clock. Large-neck olives, it's the same. With mayfly, it's the sluggish areas, the sort of typical slower moving water, U-bend, you need to concentrate your effort. And then again, I mean, I had an experience, I fished the upper Severn over the weekend. And it was the first time we went there. And it's exactly this knowledge of trying to find where the fish are. In order to do that, irrespective of which river you go to fish, you need to understand some of these features of the river, where the deep pools are, where the creases are, etc., etc. Sometimes the fish will withstand pressure, so you can be there catching fish after fish. Sometimes you can put the fish down, but I think, yeah, the idea of finding where the fish are, what they're taking, persevere, and then move on. That's the way you go about fishing. Not only a chalk stream, but a freestone river. The chuck and see, or just searching the water, is monotonous and is not as exciting. Let's scroll down. Okay, that's Paul Clancy. What do you think of the balance between anglers' access, who pay the bills, and the habitat that is required for wild trout to thrive? Also, the anglers' artificial expectations of a chalk stream. John?
Yeah, I think we've tried as a club to move more towards the fish and a little bit away from the angler. We're always going to be a Southern Chalk Streams club. We're always going to mow the grass. We're always going to make it easy for a gentleman to catch a fish. But we don't have to mow so much grass. We don't have to keep the fringe quite as short and neat as we do. We can allow flowering species to seed. We can let things be quite a bit more wild than they are. And in stream the same. The chalk streams are fairly safe wading environments on the whole, but when we introduce wood, we make things a little bit more difficult, but there's plenty of places where you fish in much more hazardous environments than this. So I think we'll always be trying to produce comfortable, easy, gentleman's fishing, but we have shifted it a good way and we can shift it some more.
Okay. Question from Bas Rees, also known as Iron Blue, I believe, on the forum. In the last few years, there has been a greater demand for access to rivers for other water sports such as canoeing, boarding, and free swimming as examples. This has been gathering pace. Do you see any conflict in river restoration and habitat improvements? Should open access be increased?
Yes, I think there's conflict all around, and particularly so on rivers that have an economy around them like the Southern Chalk Streams. The more expensive the fishing is, the more likely people are going to want to protect it from others. Miles and miles of Southern Chalk Stream are private. The public have much less access than they have to rivers in the north or Wales or anywhere like that. They want to walk the river banks. We would probably like them to, but we fear that they will jump in the water and let their dog in the water and whatever else they do. I think it's an ongoing conflict. What we try to do is to be as flexible as we can be within the constraints of the often very private estates that we're working with. It's a difficult one. I think there will be a great many issues, and they'll be particularly acute on the chalk streams. We haven't seen quite so much upstream of Salisbury as others might have seen in terms of boating and other incursions on the water. But I think we have to be a little tolerant. I mean, what's really quite noticeable very often is when we're messing about in the water, the fish get quite used to it, and they're very quickly back on station after we've passed through, or even after we've had a digger in the river. So we can probably be a bit more tolerant about having more people around. But often we're constrained by the fact that we're on very private ground, and paying quite a bit of money to be there.
Yeah, I think the last question is, I think we partly answered it, but I think it's worth also answering it as from the club standpoint. And this question came from an anonymous attendee, and it says we have a massive problem in that we are still slaves to the old traditional models of management. We have heard the word traditional used this evening to describe SADAC's approach to fishing. Perhaps we need a completely different mindset towards how we manage, value, and fish these rivers. Discuss.
Yes, I think when I referred to us being a traditional club, I referred to the methods we use to fish. I don't think I meant at all that we wanted to continue the quotes traditional chalk stream management techniques that have served for hundreds of years, and those have been talked about earlier on. We are concerned to change that, to produce a more wild fishing experience. I think things have moved. I think I can see that in the angling press. Over 10 years, more people want to hike into the hills to fish than they want to stand by a reservoir and catch rainbows. And I think most of the new members that we sign up for the club are more interested in that wild experience. So yes, traditional in terms of method, because you can make it very easy to catch trout, and that's really not what it's about. It's about something that's a semi-art, a pastime, a sport. It involves lots of rules that put constraints on us as to how we do it. So yes, traditional in terms of how we do it, certainly not traditional in the way we look after the river. And I think we do need to think much more wildly, much more wild about how we do things. I think we do. I think we've changed a huge amount in 10 years. I would cite stocking, massive change, weed cut approach, massive change, the way we look after the fringes, massive change. All three of those against better advice from quite a few people along the way. And the same applies to much of the river restoration work that we've done. Often we've put the tree in the old member's favourite fishing place and ruined it for him. The fact that there are several more fish in the same place now doesn't seem to occur to them. But yeah, let's not be traditional about how we look at the chalk stream. Let's be a bit more imaginative.
Right, I'm looking at the clock and it's past 9 o'clock. I hope you enjoyed the evening. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their excellent presentations, and you, John. And I'd like to also thank all the members for their support throughout the year, and particularly those who have taken the time and put the effort to write letters to their local MPs and challenge them as to why they voted for the party line when it comes to water quality. And as you heard from also Peter and Jack and Dave, you know, it's just down to us to really connect and engage with other stakeholders in the who live next to the river, or river users. And it could be a river user who simply has a dog and sometimes he takes him for a walk. But every opportunity that we can engage with the public and explain what we're doing in the wider sense, not the catching of the fish. And yes, we talked about catching fish and we showed you the catch returns, but a good part of our conversation this evening, and not only, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, it revolves about habitat work, it revolves about what lives in the system, in the river and outside the river. So thank you very much. And for those that they are after the grayling, tight lines. Thank you all.
Good night.